Hello, welcome back. I'm gonna pick back up on the country of the blind, exactly where I left off yesterday. Thanks for coming back again. Instead, he sat up in the place where they had left him, resting his limbs and turning the unanticipated circumstances of his arrival over and over in his mind. Every now and then he laughed, sometimes with amusement and sometimes with indignation. Unformed mind, he said. Got no senses yet. They little know they've been insulting their heaven-sent king and master. I see. I must bring them to reason. Let me think. Let me think. He was still thinking when the sun set. Nunez had an eye for all beautiful things. And it seemed to him that the glow upon the snow fields and glaciers that rose above the valley on every side was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. His eyes went from that inaccessible glory to the village and irrigated fields, fast sinking into the twilight, and suddenly a wave of emotion took him. And he thanked God from the bottom of his heart that the power of sight had been given him. He heard a voice calling to him from out of the village. Yaho there, Bogota! Come hither! At that, he stood up smiling. He would show these people once and for all what sight would do for a man. They would seek him, but not find him. You move not, Bogota, said the voice. He laughed, he laughed noiselessly and made two stealthy steps aside from the path. Trample not on the grass, Bogota. That is not allowed. Nunez had scarcely heard the sound he made himself. He stopped, amazed. The owner of the voice came running up the pebbled path towards him. He stepped back into the pathway. Here I am, he said. Why did you not come when I called you? Said the blind man. Must you be led like a child? Cannot you hear the path as you walk? Nunez laughed. I can see it, he said. There is no such word as see, said the blind man after a pause. Cease this folly and follow the sound of my feet. Nunez followed, a little annoyed. My time will come, he said. You'll learn, the blind man answered. There is much to learn in the world. Has no one told you? In the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. What is blind? Asked the blind man, carelessly over his shoulder. 4 days passed, and the fifth found the king of the blind still incognito as a clumsy and useless stranger among his subjects. It was, he found, much more difficult to proclaim himself than he had supposed. And in the meantime, while the mediated, while he mediated his coup d'état, he did what he was told and learnt the manners and customs of the country of the blind. He found working and going about at night a particularly irksome thing, and he decided that should be the first thing he would change. They led a simple, laborious life. These people, with all the elements of virtue and happiness, as these things can be understood by men, they toiled, but not oppressively. They had food and clothing sufficient for their needs. They had days and seasons of rest. They made much of music and singing, and there was love among them and little children. It was marvelous with what confidence and precision they went about their ordered world. Everything, you see, had been made to fit their needs. Each of the radiating paths of the valley area had a constant angle to the others, and was distinguished by a special knot upon its curving. All obstacles and irregularities of path or meadow had long since been cleared away. All their methods and procedure arose naturally from their special need. Their senses had become marvelously acute. They could hear and judge the slightest gesture of a man a dozen paces away, could hear the very beating of his heart. Intonation had long replaced expression with them, and touches, gesture, and their work with hoe and spade and fork was as free and confident as garden work can be. Their sense of smell was extraordinarily fine. They could distinguish individual differences as readily as a dog can, and they went about the tending of the llamas, who lived among the rocks above and came to the wall for food and shelter, with ease and confidence. It was only when, at last, Nunez sought to assert himself that he found how easy and confident their movements could be. He rebelled only after he had tried persuasion. He tried it first on several occasions to tell them of sight. "Look you here, you people," he said, "there are things you do not understand in me." Once or twice, one or two of them attended to him. They sat with faces downcast and ears turned intelligently towards him, and he did his best to tell them what it was to see. Among his hearers was a girl with eyelids less red and sunken than the other, so that one could almost fancy she was hiding eyes, whom especially he hoped to persuade. He spoke of the beauties of sight, of watching the mountains, of the sky and the sunrise, and they heard him with amused incredulity that presently became condemnatory. They told him there were indeed no mountains at all, but that the end of the rocks, where the llamas grazed, was indeed the end of the world. Thence sprang a cavernous roof of the universe, from which the dew and the avalanches fell. And when he maintained stoutly the world had neither end nor roof, such as they supposed, They said his thoughts were wicked. So far as he could describe sky and clouds and stars to them, it seemed to them a hideous void, a terrible blackness in the place of the smooth roof to things in which they believed. It was an article of faith with them that the cavern roof was exquisitely smooth to the touch. He saw that in some manner he shocked them and gave up that aspect of the matter altogether, and tried to show them the practical value of sight. One morning he saw Pedro in the path called 17, and coming towards the central houses, but still too far off for hearing or scent, and he told them as much. In a little while, he prophesied, Pedro will be here. An old man remarked that Pedro had no business on path 17, and then, as if in confirmation, that individual, as he drew near, turned and went transversely into path 10. That individual, as he drew near, turned and went transversely into path 10, and so back with nimble paces towards the outer wall. They mocked Nunez when Pedro did not arrive, and afterwards, when he asked Pedro questions to clear his character, Pedro denied and outfaced him, and was afterwards hostile to him. Then he induced them to let him go a long way up the sloping meadows towards the wall with one complacent individual, and to him he promised to describe all that happened among the houses. He noted certain goings and comings, but the things that really seemed to signify to these people happened inside of or behind the windowless houses. The only things they took note of to test him by, and of these he could see or tell nothing. And it was after the failure of this attempt, and the ridicule they could not repress, that he resorted to force. He thought of seizing a spade, and suddenly smiting one of them to earth. Oh, he thought of seizing a spade and suddenly smiting one or two of them to earth, and so, in fair combat, showing the advantage of eye. He went so far with that resolution as to seize his spade, and then he discovered a new thing about himself, and that was that it was impossible for him to hit a blind man in cold blood. He hesitated, and found them all aware that he had snatched up the spade. They stood alert, with their heads on one side, and bent ears towards him, for what he would do next. Put that spade down, said one, and he felt a sort of helpless horror. He came near obedience. Then he thrust one backwards against the house wall and fled past him out of the village. He went athwart one of their meadows, leaving a track of trampled grass behind his feet, and presently sat down by the side of one of their way. He felt something of the buoyancy that comes to all men at the beginning of a fight, but more perplexity. He began to realize that you cannot even fight happily with creatures who stand upon a different mental basis to yourself. Far away, he saw a number of men carrying spades and sticks come out of the street of houses and advance in a speeding line along the several paths towards him. They advanced slowly, speaking frequently to one another, and ever and again the whole cordon would halt and sniff the air and listen. The first time they did this, Nunez laughed, but afterwards he did not laugh. One struck his trail in the meadow grass and came stooping and feeling his way along. For 5 minutes he watched the slow extension of the cordon, and then his vague disposition to do something forthwith became frantic. He stood up, went a pace or so towards the circumferential wall, turned, and went back a little way. There they all stood in a crescent, still and listening. He also stood still, gripping his spade very tightly in both hands. Should he charge them? The pulse in his ears ran into the rhythm of "In the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king." Should he charge them? He looked back at the high and unclimbable wall behind. Unclimbable because of its smooth plastering, but withal pierced with many little doors. And at the approaching line of seekers, behind these others were now coming out of the streets of houses. Should he charge them? "Bogota!" called one. "Bogota! Where are you?" He gripped his spade still tighter and advanced down the meadows towards the place of habitation. And directly he moved, they converged upon him. "I'll hit them if they touch me," he swore. "By heaven, I will! I'll hit!" he called aloud. "Look here, I'm going to do what I like in this valley. Do you hear? I'm going to do what I like and go where I like." They were moving in upon him quickly, groping, yet moving rapidly. It was like playing blind man's buff, with everyone blindfolded except one. "Get hold of him!" cried one. He found himself in the arc of a loose curve of pursuers. He felt, suddenly, he must be active and resolute. "You don't understand," he cried in a voice that was meant to be great and resolute, and which broke. "You are blind, I can see. Leave me alone." "Bogota, put down that spade and come off the grass." The last order, grotesque in its urban familiarity, produced a gust of anger. "I'll hurt you," he said, sobbing with emotion. "By heaven, I'll hurt you! Leave me alone!" He began to run, not knowing clearly where to run. He ran from the nearest blind man because it was a horror to hit him. He stopped and then made a dash to escape from their closing ranks. He made for where a gap was wide, and the men on either side, with a quick perception of the approach of his paces, rushed in one oh, rushed in on one another. He sprang forward, and then saw he must be caught, and swish! The spade had struck. He felt the soft thud of hand and arm, and the man was down with a yell of pain, and he was through. Through! And then he was close to the street of houses again, and blind men, whirling spades and stakes, were running with a sort of reasoned swiftness hither and thither. He heard steps behind him just in time, and found a tall man rushing forward, swiping at the sound of him. He lost his nerve, hurled his spade a yard wide at his antagonist, and whirled about and fled, fairly yelling as he dodged another. He was panic stricken. He ran furiously to and fro, dodging when there was no need to dodge, and in his anxiety to see on every side of him at once, stumbled. For a moment he was down, and they heard his fall. Far away in the circumferential wall, a little doorway looked like heaven, and he set off in a wild rush for it. He did not even look around at his pursuers until it was gained, and he had stumbled across the bridge, clambered a little way along the rocks, to the surprise and dismay of a young llama, who went leaping out of sight and lay down sobbing for breath. And so his coup d'etat came to an end.